Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a look at the HE400i 2020 edition. This is a headphone I've been requested quite a lot to review on the channel, so I was really pleased when HiFiMan agreed to send me a sample. I found myself really enjoying a number of HiFiMan's products in recent times, including the Sundara and the recently reviewed Deva. So I was really interested to see if their most budget option, the HE400i, could come close to the same levels of performance and enjoyment as I found in both the Sundara and the Deva. You might see I've got two headphones here on my desk. That's because the other headphone I've got in this review is the HiFiMan HE4XX, which was a Mastrop collaboration. These headphones are almost identical in terms of the driver and the design used, but they do sound a little bit different, and so one of the key comparisons I've got coming up is to consider whether the HE4XX is a better choice for the $11 more than buying the HE400 direct from HiFiMan. Before I get into the review, I just want to mention that we're rapidly approaching 10,000 subscribers, which is super exciting, so thank you to all of you who've subscribed, and as part of the celebration for reaching 10,000 subscribers, I'm going to have a giveaway of two products. Those two products are going to be the Shanling UP4 and the Shanling UA1. So the UP4 I've just recently reviewed. It's a Bluetooth style DAC that's also a wired DAC and a headphone amp as well, of course, and also the UA1, which is just a pure wired USB dongle style DAC. So if you're interested in winning either of those, all you need to do is make sure you're subscribed and watch out for my next video, which is a review of the Jotunheim 2 from Shit, where I'll be giving you the instructions about how you can win either or both even of those Shanling devices. So make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned for the Jotunheim 2 review as we approach 10,000 subscribers. For now though, let's get into the review of the HE400i by looking at what you get in the box. The HE400i here retail for $169 and that equates to about 260 Australian dollars. So they're not an expensive headphone by any stretch of the imagination. And as you'll hear later on, they stack up really nicely in terms of price against some pretty strong competition. So I'm going to chat about that competition shortly, but first let's keep talking about the specs and the design and comfort of the HE400. These are a 35 ohm driver, so moderate impedance, nothing too special there, but they're only 93 decibels sensitivity rating, and that means they're actually relatively hard to drive. And that surprised me because HiFiMan market these as portable or at least easy to drive headphones that you can run from, say, a smartphone or a small digital audio player. But the 93 decibel rating is not a particularly sensitive level. To put that into perspective, these are going to require to reach 120 decibels, which is way more than you should listen to, but it's a good indicator for the maximum volume you might need to hit the peaks in high dynamic range music. These would require, to get to that 120 decibel mark, 502 milliwatts, so that's about half a watt, and more importantly, it requires 4.2 volts and about 120 milliamps. So that should be doable for most quality portable devices, but it's going to be difficult for some of the smaller dongle style DACs on the market. And that's where I think it's strange that they've marketed it the way they do, because it's not a super easy to drive headphone. That's not a knock on it, it just means you've really got to know what you're buying when you're picking up the HE400. Before you completely write it off though, let me provide a bit of extra information. To reach a level of just 85 decibels, which should be a comfortable and safe listening level for ongoing listening, to get to 85 decibels, these only need 1 milliwatt. So all of a sudden what you see is that they're going to work in most cases, but if you are someone that likes to push with EQ and get extra output from the bass, for instance, or if you like to listen particularly loud, or to music with massive dynamic range like orchestral music and the like, you may find the 400s need a little bit of extra juice behind them. They're not by any stretch something that you need a 15 watt amplifier for. It's just something that you might need a bit more than the average dongle device can provide. And at the price point that you're buying these at, say, $169 US, that to me is a bit surprising that they almost require you to spend more to get the maximum possible performance out of a headphone like this. That said, I've tried them with a variety of devices, and for my listening levels, which rarely go above about 85 decibels, I had absolutely no problems at all. So I just want to put it all into context for you. They're fine in most listening cases, unless you want to go really loud. You'll be okay with most devices to drive them. So let's talk now a bit more about the design. Much like the Davers, although obviously in a different colorway, you've got this thick padded headband, these rounded end caps where the headband meets the yoke. The yokes themselves are metal, the cups are plastic by the feel of them, and then they've got this basic metal grille with the holes punched in it. On the bottoms here, you've got a pair of 3.5mm connectors. So that's great news in that it's a very easy connector to get for custom cables. You can swap cables from other earphones and headphones. And then in terms of the pads, you've got a nice slightly angled leather and velour style ear pad, which is pretty common across most of the HiFiMan range now. So all in all, they feel pretty good in the hand. They feel sturdy enough for a cheap basic headphone, and there's not really much to knock about them. Some are going to like the plain black colorway. Some are going to prefer something with a little bit more kind of pizzazz to it. I personally don't mind them. I think they're fine, they're subtle, and they do the job well. The cable that comes with them is also really nicely put together. It doesn't scream expensive or anything, but it's got a nice molded 3.5mm plug at one end and some nicely finished plugs for the 3.5mm into the headphone itself. Now obviously it is single-ended, but you could run these balanced with the dual entry into the ear cups if you wanted to. It would just require re-terminating or buying an aftermarket cable. I've knocked the HiFiMan cables in some of my recent reviews, so it's nice to see a better quality cable coming out with the HE400, and it says they're making changes and improvements constantly to the rest of their range. So all in all, at this point, we've got a well-made headphone with a decent cable, relatively okay specs in terms of drivability from a range of devices, and then it's all going to come down to whether it sounds good and whether you like the tonality. So let's chat about that now. Quite similar to my recent review of the HiFiMan Daver, the HE400i has a fairly light and agile sound. It doesn't have a great deal of weight to the notes, and that for me is a bit of a drawback, but it does make them very agile and nimble and quite detailed sounding without pushing anything at you. The soundstage has good width and relatively good placement and image focus, but it doesn't have a huge amount of depth. That said, I think it's a pretty impressive soundstage for a $169 headphone. As you'll hear later, I do think it's got the best overall soundstage presentation of all of the comparisons I've got in this review, so in that regard it's doing an amazingly good job at the price point where it sits. One of the tracks I listened to when testing the HE400s was Soon As I Get Paid by Kev Mo. On that track, which is wonderfully recorded, the HE400s sound like a much more expensive headphone. They produce a beautiful sense of image, really good tonal balance overall, although I would have liked a little bit more weight in the bass, but generally speaking, they vastly outperform my expectations of a $169 headphone. They're not yet competing with something like the Sundara or some of the other headphones in my collection at higher price points, but for where they sit price-wise, I think they're excellent. As you'll see from the graph I've got on screen now, the HE400s have a pretty linear response through the mids. They've got some significant roll-off in the bass, and that's where they lose a little bit of that weight in the notes, but overall they're fairly linear with the exception of that slight peak in the treble, which I believe gives them that sense of agility and speed and detail without going too far into sibilance or overdoing the treble. To me, they're not a perfectly tuned headphone, but they're very, very good, particularly for the price, and realistically, the only thing missing for me is a bit better balance down in the lower registers to help offset that peak in the treble. But that can always be addressed with EQ if you're into using EQ. Now, I'm not traditionally a big EQ user, but thanks to one of the patrons of the channel chatting to me about using Sonarworks, I recently grabbed a copy for the trial and tested it out with some headphones. One of the headphones I tried it with was the HE400 here, and it made a massive difference. So if you want to know more about Sonarworks, I'm going to do a full review of the software very soon, but for now I just want to mention that it's special software with pre-built calibrations to help provide an in-system EQ to flatten out the frequency response of all different headphones. What I heard from the HE400s after applying the Sonarworks calibration was the bass performance from this driver is exceptional, again for the price of the headphone. So whilst the tuning that comes from the factory is a little bit lean on the bass, it's not to suggest that the HE400s cannot produce wonderful bass. It just needs a bit of help from EQ to get there. What the balancing of the Sonarworks calibration also did was pull back a little bit of that treble peak and takes away just a tiniest hint of dryness that you get in the treble as a result of it. Now, I didn't so much notice the dryness when I was listening to the headphone normally. It was more when it was removed by the calibration that I suddenly realized it was there. So it's very, very subtle, but it is improved by the Sonarworks software and could also be easily improved by your own custom EQ curve if you wanted to. One thing worth mentioning is that by bringing a bit of extra bass into the HE400 sound, what you are going to do is reduce the sense of soundstage width. And that's just a simple fact of the way our ears hear different sounds and the way masking occurs when we get bass notes that start to get louder than other cues in the music. But ultimately, what this little experiment showed me was that the HE400s are an incredibly capable driver that's not quite perfectly tuned, but is incredibly good for the price and does have the ability to sound exceptional once given a bit of EQ tweaking. So at this point I was pretty impressed with the HE400s and I wanted to see how they stacked up against some competition. The first and most obvious choice was the HE4XX that I already had here. Now I bought these myself secondhand and they came in pretty shabby condition, so I've since replaced the pads with some aftermarket ones, but as far as I can tell they're basically identical to the stock pads, and in every other way they seem to be in good working order now. So I've tried these out, I've tested them side by side, and in their stock form, which is how I like to test all headphones initially, as in without any EQ or that Sonarworks calibration applied, what I found was that the HE400i is definitely the more agile and nimble sounding headphone, whereas the 4XX has a little bit of a thicker and smoother sound. Now, if you take a look at the graph comparison I've got on screen, where the HE4XX is the dotted line, what you'll notice is there's not a huge range of difference between the two frequency responses, but there's just enough of a boost in the bass and just enough of a drop in that upper mid-lower treble region that it does change the characteristics of the sound. I think there's also maybe a little bit more going on in terms of perhaps the damping being used to achieve this tuning, because as I'll talk about in a moment, even with the Sonarworks calibrations applied, there's a slight difference in the tonal character of both headphones, even when they're essentially measuring flat, having had the calibration applied. In their stock form, I found that I prefer the HE400i overall, and I think that's partly because the HE4XX comes across a little bit slower in its sound, and that's where I'm saying I think there's more going on than just frequency response, because the sense of speed is more than just which frequencies are louder or softer. It's also going to come down to how quickly the driver is starting and stopping, and therefore how it provides the leading edge of those notes and the transients in the music. So to me, the HE4XX does sound a bit slower in its stock form, and it makes things just a little bit muddy compared to the very agile sounding HE400. I did prefer the note weight in the HE4XX, but it wasn't worth the trade-off because, as well as being slower, it also loses a bit of focus in the image and becomes a little bit more narrow in the soundstage as well. So if you're like me and you're not going to be applying EQs to these headphones, I do think the HE400 is the better choice of headphone. If you're looking to use something like Sonarworks or your own custom EQ curve though, what I found which surprised me was that once an EQ curve was applied to both to bring them as close to flat as possible, I actually found I preferred the HE4XX because of its slightly heavier note weight. And this is where I'm saying there's, I think, more going on in terms of the driver damping, the way it moves, the way it's controlled, that I actually prefer how the HE4XX delivers the notes, even when the frequencies are being balanced out. That's going to be very personal though. Some of you, depending on the music you're listening to and your personal tastes, may prefer the speed and agility of the HE400. I personally prefer that little bit of extra note weight that I get from the HE4XX. Both of them, though, are outstanding headphones when you consider their prices at $169 and $180 US. Very hard to go past either, and indeed you actually could make the decision based on the aesthetics and the design of each rather than the sound quality, because they're pretty close once you apply the EQ curves. In stock form, just to reiterate, I would definitely take the HE400 if you're not applying any EQ. In case you're not familiar with the HE4XX, I should also mention they use this leather, slightly rough looking style headband with a couple of exposed splines and a slider that's also kind of bolted onto the outside of the headband. So to me, they're a slightly more rugged look. I don't really know which one I prefer. I think they're much of a muchness, but interestingly, these use a 2.5mm connector, whereas these, the HE400s, use a 3.5mm connector. So factor that into your decision making, but it's going to be very hard to go wrong with either. One other thing I should mention just while I think of it is I prefer the cable from the HE400. It looks better finished and of better quality than the slightly crappy cable that comes with the HE4XX and is more reminiscent of the older style HiFiMan cables that I really don't like so much. So I've got two more comparisons now for you, or I was going to have two more, I should say. The reason I say I was going to was that one of the comparisons I had in mind was for the noticeably cheaper BLON BL30 headphones that have recently come on the market. If you've seen my review of those, you'll know why I'm not going to bother with the comparison, and it's because I think they're not a good headphone. Even though they're $50 odd cheaper than the HE400s, I definitely think you should spend the $50 more. Even if you've got to save a little bit longer, you're going to get much better sound out of the HE400 than I believe you're ever going to get out of the BLON BL30. Unless you're heavily into modding, but that's not what this review's about. So we're going to skip straight past the BLON BL30 and move to my final comparison, which is the Beyerdynamic DT880 250 ohm special edition. So these are the all black versions that I had hanging behind me on the wall. They've been my go-to entry-level headphone for some time now. They're a nice headphone, they're well made, they're light, they're comfortable. They do have a fixed cable, which is a shame, but in most ways it doesn't really cause any problems. When I bought these on drop, they were just a few dollars cheaper than a pair of HE400s, so they're a really good comparison in a lot of ways. These are 250 ohm versions, as I mentioned before, so they're also quite difficult to drive and probably actually a bit harder in most cases than I've found the HE400s to be. As for sound quality, during my testing, one of the tracks I listened to was City by Sarah Bareilles. On that particular track, I found that the DT880 just sounded a bit hollow compared to the HE400, and that's because the DT880 is more of a V-shaped headphone, whereas the HE400 is a much flatter response overall. It's not perfectly flat as we've already seen, but I do believe it's a better response and therefore gives the mids a bit more weight and produces a more natural tone overall. I do like the bit of extra bass that the DT880 brings, but again, this is talking stock and it is something, as we've already identified, that you can fix with EQ on the HE400s. The overall timbre of the headphones, particularly through the mids, I'd lean towards the HE400s for, and ultimately once comparing them, I found the HE400 more enjoyable. In terms of staging, they both do things well. The DT880 throws a wider stage and a bigger sounding stage than the 400s, but the 400 does a better job at focusing the sounds. So for me, I would lean towards the 400 because I think that focus is more important in producing a sense of realism to the music rather than just throwing a big stage where everything's a little bit vague in its placement. They both are good headphones, but I think as an all-rounder that's going to sound good with pretty much everything, I think the 400 is the one I would go for because it is a bit more balanced. It's shown how well it responds to EQ. I'm not saying the DT880 doesn't respond well to EQ, but the HE400 starts a bit closer to the right tuning for my taste, and therefore I would lean that way out of these two. I'd also plan to have one other comparison here, and that was with the Sennheiser HD560S. Sennheiser Australia have kindly offered to send me a sample for review, so that is coming soon, but it didn't quite arrive in time to compare with the HE400s. So if you want to see both the review of the HD560S and a comparison between those and some or all of these, depending on which ones I need to move on to make room for other gear, I will do the review soon, and I can promise you the HE400s will be compared to the HD560s in that review. So make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned for that one. In the meantime though, hopefully by now you've gotten the sense that I think the HE400i 2020 version is a fantastic headphone and an absolute bargain for the price. To get this level of performance for $169 is absolutely crazy. They scale really well with higher end gear, they work really nicely with basic gear as well, so long as you've got a decent amount of power to work with, and so they're really hard to go past as a recommendation entry-level headphone. I've previously thought the DT880 to be a nice starting headphone, and I still stand by that. They're a good, solid performer that's very comfortable and very easy to live with. Having said that though, I think the 400s are going to replace them as my go-to entry-level recommendation because I just think they do everything a little bit better than the DT880s, and they happen to be easier to drive as well and can also be run balanced when you need to. So with that in mind, thanks once again to HiFiMan for sending across the sample of these. I think they're absolutely brilliant, and I will wholeheartedly recommend them both to you right now, but also to anybody that asks me for an entry-level recommendation in the future. If you're interested in buying a pair of HE400s, I'll put a link below where you can click through and pick up a pair of your very own to see just why I'm saying such good things about them. For now though, don't forget to subscribe if you want to be in the draw for the 10,000 subscriber giveaway. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.